Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to decode the architectural DNA of New York City's most common apartments. We're literally peeling back the walls to reveal how historical constraints and, deep class divides totally shaped the way people live. If you've ever stared at an impossibly tiny kitchen or wondered why certain buildings look the way they do, well, you are definitely in the right place. All right, let's dive right into our categorical tour of the city. We're going to go step by step through 1. Brownstones in the grid, 2. Railroads and tenements, 3. The classic 6, 4. Soho's manufacturing lofts, and finally 5. The truth about studios. Starting off with Section 1, Brownstones and the 1811 grid. Our journey really begins with the foundational geometry of the city. The famous 1811 grid was mathematically laid out by splitting blocks into these 25-foot wide slivers. Let's actually look at the math here, because it's fascinating. They designed a standard 200-foot block, right? Then followed it with a 60-foot street. Together, that equals 260 feet. Now, if you multiply that 260 feet by 20, you hit roughly 5,200 feet, which reveals exactly why 20 city blocks make a perfect mile. It was just this incredibly structured, almost rigid way to organize a rapidly expanding metropolis. And that brings us to the defining architectural feature of the 19th century brownstone, the stoop. Constructed for the middle and upper classes, these beautiful sandstone homes were built in long rows with shared party walls. That meant natural light only came from the very front and the very back. But here's the wild part. While stoop is simply a Dutch word for staircase, there was a surprisingly practical and kind of gross reason the parlor floor, the main entrance, was elevated. It kept the wealthy families and their pristine clothes safely above the mountains of horse manure that literally filled 19th century streets. Meanwhile, the servants? They had to enter down at ground level. Which naturally leads to a question you've probably asked yourself if you've ever walked the streets of New York dodging black garbage bags. Why are mountains of trash always piled up on the sidewalks? It's such a crazy contrast to those beautiful brownstones sitting right behind them. Well, the crucial point is that back in 1811, when this grid was set in stone, people just didn't generate much waste. I mean, they had privies in the backyards, they reused almost everything, and any unused food scraps, those went directly to livestock. Because of that, alleyways for hiding trash simply weren't needed. Fast forward to today with our modern packaging and just immense daily waste, and that single 1811 decision is the exact reason modern New Yorkers are forced to put their bags directly on the curb. Let's move on to Section 2, Railroads and Tenements. So, while the wealthy were enjoying those grand brownstones, a massive influx of immigrants led to some incredibly cramped living spaces for the working class. To really grasp what these apartments felt like, you have to understand the layout, specifically the enfilade. Now, in a grand European museum, an enfilade is majestic. But in a tiny New York railroad apartment, it meant passing through every single crowded room just to get to the back. Imagine wanting to go from the front room to the kitchen, and you have to walk directly through everyone else's bedrooms. It left absolutely zero privacy for the huge families crammed inside. And this evolved into a desperate battle against disease. In the late 1800s, entire families lived in single, windowless rooms with absolutely no fresh air. It was squalor. But then Jacob Riis released his devastating book, How the Other Half Lives. His work truly opened the public's eyes and ultimately forced the city to mandate light, fresh air, and indoor toilets in 1901. Fast forward to the 1930s, and the paradigm shifted entirely. We saw the construction of massive public housing projects designed with big courtyards specifically to bring sunlight to the working class. But let's go back to those 1901 reforms for a second, because architects had to figure out how to add windows to the middle rooms of existing tightly packed buildings. Their big solution? The Dumbbell plan. Now, while this dumbbell shape technically provided a sliver of air, it ironically created a brand new hazard. Because people lived so impossibly close together, these incredibly narrow air shafts quickly filled up with garbage thrown from windows and stagnant water. It basically created a completely new breeding ground for the exact same diseases the law was trying to prevent. And all this lack of space led to some, well, very strange design choices. Like, why on earth did tenement apartments have bathtubs right in the middle of the kitchen? This is definitely one of those incredibly surprising facts about old New York real estate, and believe it or not, it still exists in some apartments today. The answer is just pure, unfiltered pragmatism. As our architectural source notes, the apartments were just so small they didn't have room for a proper bathroom. So it made sense that the bathtub would go right next to the existing plumbing. Think about it. The kitchen sink was often the only running water in the entire flat. Families would even build custom hard covers over these kitchen bathtubs so they could use them as extra counter space to prep food when they weren't taking a bath. Talk about multitasking, right? All right, moving uptown to Section 3, the Classic 6. Stepping totally out of the squalor, we hit the gold standard of historic Manhattan layouts. Unlike those cramped railroads we just talked about, here you'd step into a gracious foyer with a beautiful corridor leading to 6 very distinct rooms. You had a separate living room, a formal dining room, a kitchen, 2 main bedrooms, and a maid's room. But here is the kicker. Despite the massive overall size of these apartments, they featured really tiny kitchens. Why? Because only the live-in maid ever used them. The wealthy owners pretty much never stepped foot in there. So what actually enabled these massive, sprawling layouts to exist high up in the sky? It was a single technological game changer, the elevator. Before the elevator, builders were strictly bound by the 6-story walk-up limit, because, let's face it, no wealthy person wanted to climb 7 flights of stairs. The elevator completely shattered that limit, allowing developers to stack these massive Classic 6 layouts 10 to 15 stories into the air. Next, we head way downtown for Section 4, Soho's manufacturing lofts. South of Houston Street, abandoned industrial spaces became the ultimate real estate prize. See, when manufacturers packed up and left Manhattan, they left behind these stunning, massive cast-iron buildings with huge windows. Landlords were absolutely thrilled to rent out these light-filled, rough spaces to artists for incredibly cheap. But actually living there wasn't strictly legal. To bypass zoning laws, artists registered with the state as an AIR, an artist in residence. They literally hung physical AIR signs outside their doors just so firemen would know someone was sleeping inside a commercial manufacturing zone. It became this incredible artistic utopia, but it also triggered a really powerful gentrification cycle. Step 1, manufacturing leaves. Step 2, artists move in, fix the plumbing, and make the spaces livable. Step 3, high-end galleries follow the artists to showcase their massive new canvases. And Step 4, incredible wealth floods the neighborhood. So the ultimate irony here is that the artists inadvertently made the neighborhood so cool and vibrant that they entirely priced themselves out of it. By the early 1990s, they were pushed out to Chelsea and beyond. And today, this historic neighborhood is caught in a fierce modern zoning debate. It perfectly highlights the ongoing tension between urban expansion and preservation. On one side, proponents are passionately arguing for rezoning to allow inclusive, affordable housing to combat the city's housing crisis. But on the flip side, opponents argue just as fiercely that new buildings will destroy the historic cast-iron character of the neighborhood and, potentially damage their astronomical real estate values. It really is a defining battle for modern New York. And finally, Section 5, the truth about studios. The devolution of this term is wild. Originally, a studio featured double-height ceilings, multiple rooms, and was built specifically for incredibly wealthy artists who wanted to paint on a massive scale. But the modern studio? It's a single room, an efficiency layout, and has standard low ceilings. Over time, the real estate industry brilliantly, and maybe a little sneakily, hijacked this romantic, bohemian term studio and applied it to what is essentially just a tiny one-room efficiency apartment, just to make it sound a bit more grand. To show you just how grand they used to be, let's look at the number 20. That represents the 20 floors of the famous Hotel des Artistes on the West Side. Built by a collective of artists, it had 10 floors dedicated exclusively to vast, double-height spaces just for making art. And then an entirely separate 10 floors dedicated entirely to traditional living and dining. I mean, that was the true original definition of a New York studio. Which brings us to a really fascinating question. If our living spaces reflect our society's constraints, wealth, and technology, what will the apartments we build today say about us a century from now? Will they see incredible efficiency, or will they see a new kind of squalor? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. I really hope you leave today looking at the walls around you with a whole new sense of wonder.